Hello, I'm Bob Price. Over the years, we at K2 Television have made a strong effort to bring you, the people of Wyoming, quality public affairs programming. Tonight, we add another chapter to that tradition with an hour-long historical documentary titled Winter in My Soul. Winter in My Soul tells the story of the Heart Mountain Relocation Center, the camp located between Cody and Powell, where thousands of Japanese Americans and their parents were sent during World War II. The program is the work of reporter Bob Nellis and edited by Dan Davis of our staff. The work on the program began as early as last September, which included trips to the West Coast and lengthy searches for photographs and film. Much of what you'll see tonight are original pictures taken in the 1940s. Some of the film is of poor technical quality, but it is all authentic. This is the story of both pain and triumph, sadness and courage. It is an American story. It is part of Wyoming's history, just as much as the building of the railroads or the settling of Wyoming. When we saw the program, we were both moved and inspired by these people and their experiences. We hope you agree. And now, Winter in My Soul.
The attack on Pearl Harbor, a shock to Americans. Nothing like this had ever happened before. It was unbelievable. And what to expect next? People knew little about this new enemy, a foreign and mysterious culture. It was that shock, fear, and the unknown that created war hysteria and the beginning of a dark chapter in the lives of Japanese Americans and of this country. It was that hysteria in the months following December 7th that led to the forced evacuation of 120,000 Japanese Americans and their parents from the West Coast. They were ordered from their homes, sent first to assembly centers and then on to 10 camps away from the coast, on desolate federal lands far from military installations. 120,000 people put behind barbed wire simply because of the color of their skin and a hysteria that grew from ignorance, fear, and racism. This is the sad and proud story of one of those camps. The time is September 1985. The scene, a reunion in San Jose. Everyone here shared the experience of living behind barbed wire at the order of the U.S. government. 12,000 people in one camp. It was the third largest city in Wyoming.
I went up to the table and I said, did you see Tom Tokuhisa? Because that name, you know, Teddy, remember Teddy?
This is the second such meeting of the people of Heart Mountain. People who only now feel they can talk about their ordeal. Only now are the misunderstandings gone and the public receptive to what they were too embarrassed, too afraid, or too hurt to discuss openly 40 years ago. The West Coast in 1942 was still a rough place, still provincial, and given to a racism of its own. The Japanese were not allowed citizenship. The immigrants, the Issei, owned property only through their American-born children, the Nisei. They worked hard, taking land and jobs others turned down. They succeeded as truck farmers, orchardmen, shop owners, fishermen. It was the American dream, with only some of the rewards. When the war broke out, General John DeWitt was the military commander on the West Coast. War hysteria was rife. The anti-Oriental racism had resurfaced with an ugly fervor. DeWitt and politicians took advantage of that, as did groups of growers envious of the flourishing Japanese farms. DeWitt discounted well-researched reports from the FBI and Navy intelligence that showed no threat from Japanese living in America or from Japanese Americans. But DeWitt claimed there was no way to determine their loyalty because of their color. A Jap is a Jap, he told reporters. DeWitt insisted all people of Japanese ancestry leave designated military areas, which eventually were to include almost every city on the West Coast. California politicians pushed for the evacuation with strong support from General DeWitt. Congress allowed it, and President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Sugimoto was one of the first Americans to realize we were at war. He heard the Pearl Harbor broadcast while on a fishing boat on Sunday morning.
So they kept repeating it, and I can hear the cannon shots of bombs blasting in the background. So I knew a war was going on.
When the boat returned to Terminal Island, life for Japanese Americans had already changed.
And when we came in the harbor, the FBI, the Navy, everybody was there. and those that couldn't prove citizenship got hauled away.
Children, the elderly, the ill and infirm, mentally retarded, DeWitt's order included them all considered a possible threat to U.S. security, a fifth column of would-be saboteurs who would hamper the war effort and join Japanese troops in an enemy landing. Ultimately, the Japanese lobbed a few shells at a beach near Santa Barbara, but that was the closest it came to an invasion. And not one Japanese resident or Japanese American was ever found involved in espionage or sabotage. Entire neighborhoods were deserted. Families had to sell belongings at fire sale prices or give them away. Businesses that couldn't be left with friends were sold for a pittance. Many lost everything. Allowed to take just what they could carry, families left treasured belongings at curbside. Many of the Nisei didn't believe this would ever happen to them.
Well, I told my mother, she better get ready because she's an alien. She said, you better get ready too. And I said, oh no, I'm an American citizen. But we all went. So she was right.
What really gets me is in a sense, the betrayal that we felt. You know, we thought we were Americans. We thought we should be treated as Americans.
They can't just take you and put you in a concentration camp. They don't have, the government doesn't have a right to do that to you. And we thought, well, we could fight it, and that there would be enough of us that wouldn't go along with it. But we just didn't think it could happen.
These first camps were whatever was available at the time, mostly army barracks, fairgrounds, and racetracks, where some families had to live in horse stalls. At Santa Anita, residents claimed 70% of the illnesses were caused by living in the stalls, where a hasty whitewash provided the only protection from dried manure.
Right, and it's real stinchy. No matter how you wash the apron to that stall, it comes right back again with the heat. It just vapor and comes up.
While the people were coping with overcrowding at assembly centers, Milton Eisenhower, brother of the general, was organizing the War Relocation Authority, the agency to build and run the relocation camps. Eisenhower's plan was to integrate the Japanese from these camps into regular communities as soon as possible. But he met with opposition from Western governors in Salt Lake City in April of 1942. If the Japanese were too dangerous to keep in California, why wouldn't they be a danger in the Rocky Mountain states? Governor Nels Smith of Wyoming joined with other governors in demanding that the federal government be totally responsible for the evacuees and that they be sent back home after the war. Smith insisted that if Japanese were placed in Wyoming, they should be put in a concentration camp. Elsie King worked at Heart Mountain.
Well, our governor, of course, was racist. He had this fear that these people were going to stay, and we knew very well they weren't. They didn't like this wind and sand that well, and the lack of flowers and trees and so forth.
While the internees waited, the WRA built the camps. Anyone who could swing a hammer was hired to build Heart Mountain, a shack town on a prairie, as one man described it.
They put it up in a hurry, for sure. Well, imagine outside top paper with laths to hold the top paper down, and nothing inside except the space heater stove. So unless the space heater was burning all the time during the winter, it really got cold. You can freeze in one of those units.
The camp was built in only 2 months, over 450 barracks at a cost of $5 million. The trains left camps like Pomona with 500 to 1,000 people on board. People had to sit up. There were no sleepers, no air conditioning. It was hard on families with children. Some had heard about Yellowstone, the mountains, green trees, cool water, the geysers. That was their conception of Wyoming. And some had no idea at all where they were going.
They said that we were going to be relocated, and so they told you what time and that you were to board the trains. And all the trains had shades that were pulled down so you couldn't see.
Most of the reactions were similar.
Desolation, complete desolation.
Disbelief.
Disbelief?
I couldn't believe it was such a, I hate to use the word desolate, but that's about all it was. It's just, you just see nothing but sand and desert and just rows and rows of barracks.
Disappointed. It was just a wasteland, you know, and the sagebrush flying all over the place. And I just cried.
Some arrived to find a dust storm, others a blizzard in mid-September. Many had never seen snow or had to deal with the cold before. No one had suitable clothing.
And they did issue us peacoats and galoshes, you know, boots, and so I think we all lived in our peacoats because they were warm.
The discovery of their new homes was a shock as well. One room, 16 by 20 feet, for a family of 4 to 6.
It was getting real dark, and being the first tenant in there, and we didn't know where our landlords, where we were going to get our blankets or anything. So a family of 5 or 7 of us huddled together like dogs or cats do in order to keep warm. Next morning when we woke up, out the window we saw snow on the ground.
The next day, the family got 1 cot per person, 2 blankets, and warmer clothes. The barracks had no running water, no toilet, no ceiling. A lone light bulb hung from the rafters. Everything else had to be furnished by the evacuees. For some who left new homes and good businesses, it was terribly disappointing. One woman suffered a nervous breakdown and to this day is still a psychiatric patient. Others suffered from trauma as well.
I had so much stress, and since that I have an angina, and I'm still suffering with angina.
It's our parents that suffered more than the rest of us because the nieces, we were young and really didn't have much in the way of security, but it's our parents that lost a lot.
Because I know my dad was in his 40s, and you know, it really took everything out of him. My mother.
After the shock of the weather, the wind, and the guard towers eased a bit, people began building furniture from wood scraps. They also formed their own community court, police, and fire departments, and elected representatives to a camp council. The winter of '42 was one of the coldest on record. Solotech's insulation for the barracks did not arrive until December, though there had been snow all through the fall. That first winter was very hard. It was best expressed in the words of a poem printed in the camp newspaper, the Heart Mountain Sentinel. The poem was written by evacuee Miyuki Aoyama.
Snow upon the rooftop, snow upon the coal, winter in Wyoming, winter in my soul.
Many of the people in Heart Mountain were from California, where they had never experienced freezing weather. They didn't know what coal was. I remember one case where people put coal in one of the big pot-bellied stoves we had and threw a match in there and jumped back expecting the thing to start burning like natural gas. There was a good deal of suffering simply because the people were not used to that kind of weather.
The people of Heart Mountain rose to the occasion. Tetsugamoto worked on the plumbing crew at the camp.
The night the water main to the hospital broke, it was 35 below.
What did you do?
We fixed it.
If you needed to go to the restroom or take a shower, it meant crossing the yard, no matter what the weather. It was particularly hard on the elderly and small children. And there was little privacy. It wasn't uncommon for a searchlight to follow you to the latrine and back again.
It was terrible. They had stalls, Army style, I guess, with no doors, and everybody headed for the last stall, or you waited for the last stall so that, you know, there's nobody walking past you while you're sitting down.
At first, there were only showers. Then the men built their own communal bath from scrap lumber. As Christmas approached, the prospects for many were bleak. People had lost everything in the evacuation. Some could not afford gifts or anything special for the holidays. One thing there was plenty of snow, and children of staff members made the most of it. So did the Nisei children, yet 30 of them were arrested by the military guards. The hill they chose to sled down happened to be just outside the barbed wire. Bill Hosokawa ran the camp newspaper.
It was a pretty dismal first Christmas. It was our first Christmas away from home, and the people in the camps, the people in the activities department did their level best to try and lift the morale of the people. And we had a very large number of small gifts for the children that were sent to the camp from various churches around the nation. They made it a project, like churches used to send gifts to the people of Africa or whatever. They were sending gifts to the kids in the camp. And we had I recall a Santa Claus coming in, ho, 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 and all that. The kids popping their eyes in amazement and handing out gifts of tablets or pencils or mittens or socks, things like that. And it was a very warm and sentimental occasion.
Because the WRA wanted to keep people busy and the Japanese wanted to work, nearly everyone had a job in camp. There were maintenance jobs, clerks, cafeteria help. Some had more than one job. Everyone who worked was paid, but the rules would allow pay no higher than that would be received by a GI. $12, $16, or $19 a month was the most anyone could earn, even if he was a doctor in the 150-bed hospital. At first, no one could leave camp at all. Then came the call from sugar beet growers who needed field workers. Many Nisei were eager to get outside and make 50 cents an hour, but Governor Nellis was reluctant. Finally, under pressure, he allowed 1,180 men to work outside for a limited period. The fall of 1942 was spent topping sugar beets in the region. Historians today, and some farmers of that time, credit the Japanese Americans with saving the sugar beet harvest for Wyoming and Montana that year. Later, more people were allowed out on leave as ranch hands, woodcutters, and domestics in the local area. One of the more remarkable aspects of the Heart Mountain people was their agricultural productivity. The soil that seemed barren was transformed with irrigation and special skills into a truck garden that supplied not only this camp, but others. Starting with cabbages, these growers branched out into all kinds of vegetables. Peas and beans were harvested and vined at the camp. There were huge onions grown in the rocky soil, and especially abundant were the potatoes, which were harvested at times by high school students and their Caucasian teachers when there were too many men out of the camp on other jobs. The Wyoming benchland was a challenge, but by digging 1,000 more feet of canal, the internees brought water from the Shoshone River. Over the years, they turned out more than 6 million pounds of produce, not including pork from their pig farm, the chickens, or the eggs. It's still a question as to what these people might have done for Wyoming agriculture if they had stayed. Domestic life in the camp was hampered, to say the least. There was little privacy, even at dinner. There was no chance for a family discussion in the mess halls.
They just ran in, they ate what they could, and then they just ran out, and there was no family closeness. They just, it was just in and out. That was about it. There was, you lost that part of the family unit.
The food itself was nothing fancy. 38 cents a person a day. That meant a lot of starch.
Now I can still remember the macaroni and cheese. It was terrible. And the mutton they used to serve. I can never eat mutton to this day.
Despite the conditions, or perhaps because of them, youngsters were organized into clubs, societies, sports teams. There were Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Campfire Girls. Activities were planned, 2 movie theaters were built, and there were carnivals and fairs, anything to keep the young people occupied when not in school. The Sears and Roebuck catalog got a workout for a variety of items, especially ice skates. Everyone we talked with who was in the camp as a teenager said it was fun, whether skating, winning the conference titles in basketball or football, or swimming in the pond. Their parents kept the worst of their problems to themselves, and to this day, many have not talked with their children about these times. It was something best not spoken of, a stigma that lasted for decades. Consumer goods were available to internees through the camp dry goods store run cooperatively or through mail-order catalogs. Occasionally, people were allowed passes to Cody or Powell to shop, but because of the attitudes outside the camp, some ventured out only with a Caucasian companion.
Now, and Cody had more signs that no Japs allowed, Japs and dogs keep out, that sort of thing, in the barber shop and in a couple of other little shops there. You didn't see that quite so much in Powell. But for some reason, most of them did want to go to Cody. And so we'd usually time it during the part of the day when there wouldn't be too many others there. And then knowing where the signs were, I would skirt them quite a bit.
There were signs in the store window. For instance, the salesperson would approach us and would do it like, you know, they did it because they had to. A lot of them didn't even approach us, and some of them would refuse to sell to us.
At one point, the Powell City Council asked that no more passes be issued for town visits, but that request was quickly withdrawn when Camp Director Guy Robertson threatened to withhold all outside farm help. After the first 6 months, families and individuals were allowed to relocate. That was the original idea of the relocation camps, to place people into cities where they'd be accepted and where they could lead normal lives. Applicants for leave had to pass a lengthy FBI security check and had to have a job waiting for them. Because the security checks took so long, many jobs would be filled in the meantime, so a loyalty questionnaire was developed to speed up the process. The questionnaire was also used to separate the so-called disloyal and send them to Tule Lake Center in Northern California. Tule Lake was a maximum security camp run for a time by the Army. These disloyal were not enemies, but simply people not willing to swear unqualified allegiance to a nation that put them behind barbed wire. The day of segregation was a sad one. Friends, often family members, were separated, often because of how they answered questions 27 and 28 on the questionnaire. They read, number 27, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States wherever ordered? And number 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? Many, especially the Issei, had no idea what would happen to them based on their answers.
Politically, they were loyal to the U.S., but a lot of them were in a very difficult position because they were not citizens of this country. They could not become citizens of this country. And so if they renounced Japan entirely as a political matter, they would be stateless persons, completely without a country.
On the other hand, some Nisei weren't sure how to answer number 27 since they'd been classified 4C, aliens ineligible for military service. These citizens felt insulted by that and, of course, by the evacuation. The same issue came up again when the Army lifted the military ban on Nisei enlistment in January of 1943, formed the 442nd Combat Team, and then drafted Japanese Americans from outside and inside the camps. Some Nisei didn't know what to do. Others saw it as a chance to prove their loyalty in combat. After being turned down by all four services because of the ban, Clarence Matsumura was called up to the Army. He left college and joined the Armored Division of the 442nd and eventually helped to liberate the Dachau concentration camp in Germany.
When I came up, there was bodies all over the place, but there just happened to be a few of the inmates in there that were still alive. That's why the forward scouts in the group said, the heck with that noise about not touching anything. There's people in there still alive.
The Jewish prisoners in that camp were free before Matsumura's parents were out from behind barbed wire in Wyoming. Much has been said about the 442nd, the most decorated unit in the U.S. Army in that war. The unit was so aggressive and given so many tough assignments, it lost almost its whole contingent twice over in 3 years. Its regimental slogan was "Go for broke." The Germans learned what that meant when they retreated across Europe. The Issei parents were very proud of their sons. There were service stars in the windows of many homes at Heart Mountain. Some had more than one son in the service. A Caucasian soldier said of the Nisei fighters, "They're just like us, except they fight a lot harder, buy more war bonds, and when they go home on leave, it's behind barbed wire." When the Nisei soldier returned to Heart Mountain, he was welcomed and honored. When tail gunner Ben Kuroki came to the camp for a recruitment drive, he was given a hero's welcome. There was a big parade, and everyone turned out to hear this fellow who had asked for more dangerous missions over Europe. And when the local boys came home to Heart Mountain, there was a USO, like in any other American town. There were dancing, activities, a snack bar with hot coffee and donuts. There's the impression that Heart Mountain was a good camp. No violence, no food riots. There was a strong but reasonable administration, first under Chris Ratchford, then Guy Robertson. But the internees were far from any consensus, patriotic or otherwise. In addition to the negative responses to the questionnaire, there was a Citizens Congress formed to protest internment. It pledged non-cooperation with the administration and the moderate Japanese American Citizens League. There were editorials and speeches against the infringement of their rights, and there were the draft resistors. When the draft came, some counseled against reporting for physicals. They called themselves the Fair Play Committee. Among their number was Frank Emmy.
I thought that before a person should be asked to serve in the country, that they should be treated like a citizen, at least having the same rights as any other citizen, be free. But we weren't free. We were in concentration camps with armed guards all around us, and if you stepped out, you either got shot or, in fact, in one of the camps, an old man got a little too close to the fence and he was shot. Under those conditions, I didn't think that the law would apply to us. I felt that the law was unconstitutional as applied to the camps.
Emmy and his colleagues were found guilty of counseling others to avoid the draft and sentenced to military prison. They weren't allowed bond during their appeal. The judge said they just make trouble in camp. So Emmy went to Leavenworth. Shortly after that, 63 young men refused induction from Heart Mountain. They considered themselves a loyal opposition, not traitors. They simply were demanding their constitutional rights. Their case in federal court in 1944 was the largest mass trial in Wyoming history. The Associated Press reporter covering it was so convinced by their arguments that the WRA was compelled to send a spokesman to convince him that these boys represented a minority view at Heart Mountain. All 63 were sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The appellate judge upheld the conviction, but in doing so, made an admission that the whole evacuation had been improper. He wrote, "Two wrongs do not make a right." Frank Emmy was finally released when a federal judge overturned his conviction on appeal. That, however, was after the war, and after Emmy and the Fair Play Committee spent 18 months in prison. In 1948, President Truman gave these men their only victory. He pardoned them and all Nisei draft resistors, saying they had a right to challenge an unfair government practice.
40 years later, I think we did the right thing. If we had to do it over again, we would probably do the same thing.
Once seen as turncoats or cowards, these men, including 85 draft resistors from Heart Mountain, are now viewed as heroes. It was one thing to protest the draft during an unpopular war in the 60s. It was quite another during a popular patriotic war from behind barbed wire. In 1942, Jack Corbett was a high school teacher in Lingle. He was asked to help Superintendent Clarence Carter create a school system from scratch at Heart Mountain. Corbett wrote later,
"We had a shortage of material and books. Only 50 American history texts for 300 pupils. The books had to be passed on to the next class because of the shortage. Up to 65 students were crowded into the small barracks classrooms. There were benches, no desks, and a piece of painted masonite for a blackboard."
By 1943, there was a new high school and gymnasium. Students wanted a flagpole for their school and finally found one at an old Conservation Corps camp. After it was erected, a student named Ted Fujioka asked Corbett for a dedication ceremony and to lead the Pledge of Allegiance. Corbett's son explains.
Said that Ted had come to him and the bunch of the seniors wanted to have a flagpole dedication, and they wanted to run up the flag, and it gave him little bit of concern because he didn't feel that people had been treated as fairly as they might have been and thought there might be some resentment. And Ted just told him not to worry about it. Dad asked him why, and Ted just says, well, I've got some friends.
It was a windy day in December when Jack Corbett walked out into the 20-degree temperatures to face 1,500 Japanese-American students ready to pledge allegiance to their country. The organizer of the event, Ted Fujioka, continued as a student leader, became president of his class, and enlisted after graduation. He died at Anzio a few months later. While Heart Mountain was not a concentration camp in the Nazi sense or a penitentiary, it still was not pleasant. However, many endured the hardships because they had no other choice. Later, many wished they would have fought the evacuation.
Why in the devil did we go over there, out of our own home? The folks broke their neck to buy that place, buy our home, and a piece of property. We only had 4 acres, but then we bought 40 acres there in Santa Clara. We only held that, let's see, about 6 months, I think, yeah, and then boom, we had to evacuate, so.
We were all young, in fact, too young, and we were more or less subservient to whatever the rules were. And when they said we had to evacuate, I think most of them felt they had to go, so they evacuated. And I think our problem was that most of our leaders were just immature, too young. That includes myself.
Most at Heart Mountain were loyal and viewed it as an insult when the Denver Post ran a series of attacks on the camp. Bill Hosokawa.
The Denver Post was, at that time, a terrible, terrible newspaper. And it was a very strongly Republican newspaper, so that anything that Franklin Roosevelt did was bad. And this was one of Roosevelt's things. And there was a good deal of hay to be made on the charge that these nasty old Japs are living it up under government sponsorship up in Wyoming, and we poor deprived American citizens ought to be doing something about it.
The stories claimed the Japanese were hoarding food, that they were enjoying wine with meals and taking advantage of government supplies. They were the work of writer Jack Carberry.
The source of that misinformation was from a fellow named Fred Best, who was a wetback from Canada. And he had been fired for something or other, incompetence or whatever. And he came down to the Denver Post and said, I've got the scoop on all this corruption up there at Heart Mountain, and I'll tell you everything about it. And Jack Carberry got all his information from Best. And I am convinced that he had the stories written before he ever went up to Heart Mountain.
About the same time, Senator E.V. Robertson of Wyoming claimed on the Senate floor that the people of Heart Mountain were living better than 75% of his constituents. Congressman Frank Barrett claimed the internees were being pampered at the taxpayers' expense. By the time congressional investigators and the camp director could respond with the facts, the damage was already done. Later, several Wyoming newspapers ran accurate stories. In the end, Best was fired and prosecuted for check forgery. Senator Robertson never set foot at Heart Mountain, though it was only a few miles from his home, and that he had many invitations to see it firsthand. The Wyoming legislature also reacted to the Japanese Americans by passing laws to keep them from voting in the state, to keep them from homesteading or buying property, and to keep them from fishing or hunting on state land. Japanese teachers and doctors were given licenses, but only good at the camp. What did the internees think of the evacuation? What do they think now, 40 years later? We asked them to describe what they missed while in camp.
Freedom, freedom of movement, freedom to go shopping, go out to eat, or do whatever you want to do when you want to do it. We were so restricted that we were afraid to walk by the side of the fence. for fear that the soldier up there would shoot you. There's 4 towers, and there's soldiers on top of their machine guns, and they're constantly surveilling the area. So you're forever checking to make sure that you're not too close to them or too close to the side of the fence.
We were being treated shabbily, I thought. But being that under the guise of military necessity, you know, they take your liberty away, and you can't do much about it.
I would say hell. It was hell. The trauma we went through, if you wanted the one word.
What was the worst thing about it? The isolation, the confinement?
The worst thing about it is that in our history, in our schools, we are taught to be Americans, and also we are considered Americans, regardless of our background. And to be treated as such really hurt me, because I've been arrested, I've been kicked around. On one hand, they tell you you're an American citizen. On the other hand, you're not. And when you get a pass to go out of the confinement Santa Anita Assembly Center, and the military police pulls you off and kicks you around, it really hurts me.
While most people today agree the Japanese Americans and their parents were not a threat, some say they still had to be put in camps for their own protection from racist elements on the coast.
I don't buy that argument at all. If you are an American citizen and you are in danger, it's up to the government to protect you, not to put the victim in a jail, but to put the aggressor in a jail. I don't think that there was that kind of public feeling that would have led to mass violence. There may have been, if the evacuees said, no, we refuse to go, force us, make us go into the camps. Then that would have been interpreted as disloyalty. But so far as random violence goes, there was very little of it.
Eventually, the people were allowed to return home to the coast, to the restricted areas. The last left the camp in November of 1945. The land reverted to the Bureau of Land Management for homesteaders. None of the Japanese were allowed to settle on the land that they worked to develop. The new homesteaders, mostly GIs and their wives, were allowed to live in the barracks, one family to a building instead of one to a room. And they could buy the buildings for $1 apiece and move them to their land. In a few years, there was little left of the third largest city in Wyoming. Today, this is all that remains of the camp: the landmark chimney that fired the boilers for the hospital, 2 warehouses that were part of the hospital complex, and 2 cottages that housed Caucasian personnel. Of the 456 barracks, the schools, mess halls, the homes of 12,000 people, there is nothing, just the empty bench land leading up to the mountain. There is this, the service roster that held the name of every man and woman from Heart Mountain who served in the war. The Wyoming wind has erased all the names. Not one of the 385 is legible. But the people haven't been forgotten. The local American Legion post erected the first monument down on the highway. Then 2 others stand up on the hill, not of wood, but mounted in stone for time and the wind. One to the people of Heart Mountain. It carries a picture of the camp for all to see. The other is a memorial to the 22 Heart Mountain men who died in World War II. Both are the work not of Japanese Americans, but of Wyoming homesteaders, people who realized what the internees endured. Spearheaded by Chester and Mary Ruth Blackburn, they have worked to have the site declared a National Historic Place, so the remaining buildings will be preserved.
When we came here, the camp was fairly intact. Most of it was still in place. That was a couple of years after the Japanese had left. And over the years, we just watched the camp disappear in front of our eyes, and it was put back into farm ground, and roads were built through it and everything. And with the Japanese coming back and trying to look around and orient themselves to where they'd lived and one thing and another, they couldn't do it. And so we just kind of had a feeling that something should be done to fix it so those people could orient themselves and that at least some little thing that was here would remain intact, maybe forever, we hope.
The Blackburns have made Heart Mountain their retirement project. They've assembled photos, documents, maps, histories, and newspaper stories about the camp, and have developed a network of contacts with former internees. They give slide presentations to schools and organizations about the camp, and are working to create a Heart Mountain Foundation to preserve their historical collection.
Well, it was rather a sad point in our history, and I think those people should be remembered, and one of the nicest things I think about them is the fact that their attitude, it was a rough time, but they still remember it that way, but I do think that they don't dwell on it, and anything that you do for them, they certainly do appreciate. You do one thing for them, and you never catch up with them again. They just will follow backwards to do things for you, or to show their appreciation for what you have done. And that, I think, the appreciation that they show and the enthusiasm that they show for what we've done is one of the things that keeps us going.
This is Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. For many Heart Mountain people, this is what today's reality looks like. Businesses, law firms, successful enterprises. You can stop people of a certain age in the shopping mall and ask, "What camp were you in?" And they'll know what you mean. They may or may not talk about it, however. The ornately landscaped parks are a far cry from the benchlands of Wyoming. It's eerie walking this site, as it is in most ghost towns. You're lucky to hear the sound of a bird. 128 people died here. 550 were born. Lives were changed, livelihoods altered, families disrupted. There are some who live here who say this is all history now. Let it be. They don't talk of reparations or even ask for an apology. They say the people who did this to us are gone now, so why bother? There are some who disagree. Among them, Toi Nataki.
Government look at precedents. And if the precedent is that you can evacuate people, incarcerate them, and all you have to do is apologize. I think it happened again. But if it costs them money, they have to pay awards like in any other damage, then I think they will look at it from a different perspective.
Heart Mountain is an example of what a government can do if its people don't care. All the Japanese Americans I interviewed for this program agreed on one thing. Everyone should know what happened here, so it never happens again. I'm Bob Nellis. Thank you for watching.